Content warning. This podcast episode contains discussions of a sensitive nature that may be triggering for some individuals.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK, sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. My name is Dee Moore, and I am a kidney warrior. This podcast is dedicated to encourage, educate, and inspire as we explore all aspects of kidney disease, related chronic illnesses, and health. In today's episode, I am bringing you a kidney warrior story. Now, there's always something you can learn from someone's story, something that can bring inspiration and hope. My guest today from South London is patient ambassador and involvement lead at Kidney Care UK, Nick Palmer, a kidney warrior whose journey with chronic kidney disease began at a very young age. From navigating higher education and the pressures of adult life while managing a complex health condition, to making bold and deeply personal decisions about his treatment. Nick's story is one of resilience, self-advocacy, and transformation. Whether you're living with kidney disease, caring for someone who is, or simply want to understand more about the power of informed choice, this conversation is not to be missed. So grab a cuppa, get comfortable, and let's explore this inspiring conversation with Nick Palmer. Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Nick?
Yeah, I think I'm very well on the whole. Thank you.
Good. Welcome to the podcast. Everyone knows what I'm going to say because I say it every time, and I sincerely do mean that I love recording Kidney Warrior story interviews because, as I say every single time, it is so powerful to learn from someone's lived experience with CKD. So I'm very excited to hear about your story, and yes, welcome. And without further ado, I'm going to start with my first question. Now, I'm going to do it a little differently actually, because normally I would chronologically we would talk about someone's kidney story, but actually today we're going to start with the end and then, like a movie, flash back to the beginning to explain how we got to that point. And so we're starting with your decision really, which is that you decided that you don't want to have a kidney transplant. Now, some people might hear this and be like, why wouldn't you want to be on the kidney transplant list? And they might find that to be a very unusual decision. But actually, by listening to your story, how things started, will explain how you got to this point. So we're starting at the end, and then we're going to flash back to the beginning. Now that we've revealed your decision, I want to go back to where it all started. And so my first question is, how did your kidney warrior journey begin, and how were you diagnosed?
Thanks, Dee. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I guess, making the decision not to have a transplant, and I say not to have a transplant, it's currently not to have a transplant. Things might change, never say never. If we flash back almost 30 years, I was diagnosed in the last year of university in 1996 with Focal Segmental Glomerulosclerosis, and a biopsy confirmed that was the cause of the nephrotic syndrome that I'd been experiencing on and off for over a year, and it hadn't been picked up by the GPs, and it took best part of a year to actually be identified by a urine dipstick test on, I don't know, it must have been the fifth or sixth visit to the GP where I grew up in Cheshire. I'd been to the GPs in Newcastle and don't think they knew what to do. And even the GPs at home had previously just put me on furosemide and hope that things would get better. But there was no proper investigation as to why a fit and healthy university student, about 19, when I was getting all these problems, should be having swollen feet and ankles. So swollen that I could draw my name in my feet and ankles. but it was transient, and so it would come and go. But eventually I had a dipstick test that confirmed there was a high amount of protein in my urine. I didn't really know what that meant. And I went to the local hospital in Macclesfield, and I stayed there for a couple of days while they collected lots of urine from me. And I was eventually booked into a hospital in South Manchester, Withington Hospital. If you're from Manchester, you might remember it. And there I had to come back in October after starting my final year, and I had a biopsy. And in some ways, a biopsy telling me that I've got a specific rare kidney disease didn't really mean much at the time. And I completed my university degree after having lots of immunosuppressants and steroids and developing to get sort of cushingoid or moon face. And it became a real issue in my last year, and, having to contend with the stresses of final year exams, being on steroids. I somehow managed to get through, and I got my degree in geography. And it wasn't for another year that it actually became apparent that I needed a kidney transplant, and the seriousness of what I was going through became present.
So for anyone listening, because we use letters and acronyms quite a lot, so people might be aware of FSGS, but what does it mean?
So it's Focal Segmental Glomerulosclerosis, so FSGS for short. And it's a rare kidney disease, although when you're a kidney patient, you seem to find other patients who have this. So it's rare, but you meet other patients with FSGS. For want of a better word, there's a circulating factor inside me that triggers a response. And it's basically almost like the kidneys attacking themselves in a way. And that circulating factor might be in the plasma in the blood. And so there are treatments. Suppressing the immune system might be one way of dealing with it. Plasmapheresis might be another way. And often the drugs used are pretty heavy duty. It's a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And they can be intrusive and timely as well. And so people who are diagnosed without a transplant first in their native kidneys, it might be steroids or immunosuppressants that are used. And with subsequent transplants, it might be with plasmapheresis. And some things work for some people and don't work for others. So there's not one tried and tested way that works for everybody. And if you have this disease, you might be fortunate that something works for you and you don't ever end up on dialysis or needing a transplant. But that wasn't the case for me, and it progressed. And by the year 2000, I was needing dialysis, and I had a fistula developed or fashioned in the summer of 2000. I was working full time. I'd gone back to university. I'd done a postgrad diploma in urban and regional town planning. I was working in town planning for a local authority, but I was having to manage a deteriorating kidney function, which was hard. And it came with all the usual suspects of tiredness, fatigue, insomnia, itchy legs. So itchy, other patients will have described this before, but it felt like you had insects running all over your legs. I would have swollen ankles and feet and legs, particularly sitting in an office all day, to the point at one point I was putting my feet up in the office at lunchtime, but people were looking at me as if I was taking it easy at work. I had people that didn't really understand my health condition. I think diversity, equality and inclusion back in the year 2000, I don't think there was much of that. And if it was very unskilled. So my long-term condition or my disability wasn't really understood by those making decisions at work. There was a backdrop of all this. I was working as hard as I could, keeping up with my peers, trying to forge a life, but knowing that I was going to go on dialysis, and the fistula was testimony to that. It was the hard evidence that I would be having dialysis, and I opted for haemodialysis. Clearly, having a fistula, I decided that I was quite happy having a fistula, but I wasn't happy having a catheter in my tummy. And there were all sorts of reasons for that. I'm sure other people have commented on catheters in their belly, and being young, wanting to attract the opposite sex. It always seemed a bit of a a killer for someone to probably see that you had a catheter in your or tubing coming out of your belly. But I was more happy to have a fistula and go for dialysis 3 times a week in a hospital. That was what I opted for, and I did. And it was really hard managing dialysis. I started dialysis as an emergency patient in the Costa Brava, taking one last holiday before I started dialysis. I became ill, seriously ill, and then I needed 3 sessions of dialysis to make sure that I was well enough to come home. And then I started dialysis in September in Manchester Hospital at Withington. And I would eventually start in the evening sessions or the twilight slot that they had there. And I was doing 5 hours from around about 8 at night, finishing in the early hours of the morning and driving myself home, probably 20 minutes into Cheshire from there. And then I was starting in university. I was already back at university in Sheffield, doing a postgrad diploma 1 day a week whilst at work. So on a Monday night, I'd have dialysis, finish in the early hours of Tuesday morning. And then by 10 to 7, I was getting up and going on the train to Sheffield. And I somehow managed to do all that. And you do what you do at the time and you push yourself. And eventually I got used to that situation and working and dialysing and pushing myself. But it was hard. I got my diploma. I moved into the private sector in planning and I had a good job. I'd already bought a flat in Manchester, so I was living away from home, which was great, and I was independent. And I was about 10, 15 minutes away from the dialysis unit. And so doing home dialysis at the time had been a consideration, but I hadn't considered it long. And it was felt at the time that I was, it was nice. I'd leave dialysis and then have my home life. And there was no sort of medicalisation of my flat. And I got on with it. I was going out at the weekends, maybe during the middle of the week, my friends in Didsbury and Manchester, and getting on with things as best I could. I think looking back, I could have done with mental health support. It was a big deal being in your 20s, trying to forge a life around housing, around relationships. And, arguably some of the decisions that I made may not have been the right decisions for me in terms of around dialysis and what type of dialysis I went for. But you only know by looking back and with fresh pair of eyes and insight. And if I'm honest, I didn't really know much about EGFRs or stages of kidney disease. I just knew about potassium because I was on dialysis, and that was my big thing, along with phosphate.
So you mentioned that looking back, you would have done things differently. What would you have done differently?
I guess when I've been a patient now since 96, so I've got the wisdom collected over a long period of time. And I guess that wisdom comes through wanting to learn more, having staff around me who are educating me and who introduced me to shared care, or it wasn't labelled shared care back then. I learned from other patients by talking to people and not keeping myself to myself. I clearly learned from the doctors and asking questions. And I guess one thing over the years through working with patients is what I've always said: involve yourself in your own care, read up, become an expert. There wasn't the wealth of resources, but there are now in terms of the wealth of resources on the Kidney Care UK website. There wasn't Kidney Care UK for one. There was BKPA and NKF, but there wasn't much real patient information out there. And back in 2000, the internet was still in its fledgling years. Patients relied on leaflets, and often you'd stuff those leaflets into the back of a pocket on, when you're leaving a unit. So I guess for me, it was all about patient education to help me make decisions. And what would I do differently? I guess knowing what I know now, I'd probably have maybe even opted for peritoneal dialysis, or may looked more towards home dialysis, hemo. But you choose what you choose at that moment in time, and that seems to work well for you. It's only with hindsight and knowing a little bit more that you might do something differently. If I look back, 3 times a week in centre dialysis played havoc with my career and my ability to be able to concentrate at work as well. And actually, with hindsight, being able to choose a dialysis that I could do at night or within the comfort of my home might have been better for my mental health. there wasn't much support. And if there was support, then you'd have to wait a long time to get any mental health support. It was never actually when you'd need it. When you're in a crisis situation, you'd have to wait months or weeks to get the support that you really needed. So, yeah, I might have opted for home dialysis from the very start, but I didn't. And I chose the dialysis that I chose. And it seemed to work as well as it could in various ways. And I remember the early days, my mum was being tested for a living kidney donor transplant. And actually, like a lot of patients, I thought I'd get my transplant. Plan A was always to have the transplant, but that didn't happen for all sorts of reasons. And it's mainly maybe to keep my mum safe, but also that the kidney from my mum might not have been that good in the end due to, unforeseen reasons. And so I found myself on haemodialysis for almost 6 years. And it was really hard towards the end. It had impacted on jobs and the ability to hold down jobs. And it impacted on, decision making to work full time. By the time I'd had that first transplant, I wasn't working a full time week. I was working around 30 hours because I'd already recognized that I needed time to myself to accommodate some break time. Working full time and having 3 lots of dialysis during the week was really hard.
So you went on to have a kidney transplant. Tell me about how that came about.
Yeah, one Friday morning, I'd had dialysis the night before because I dialysed Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays. I turned up for work. Wasn't too far away from my house. It was around the corner from my mum's, actually. And my phone started to ring, and it was unusual because there hadn't been any reception in work before. And the person at the other end said, "Is that Nick? Nick Palmer?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "This is Manchester Royal Infirmary." And before they said any more, I knew what they were going to say because Manchester Royal Infirmary never rang me. And they said, "We've got a kidney for you." And almost my life felt like it was going in slow motion at that point when they were talking to me. And I was thinking more about what am I going to do now? How am I going to explain to people at work that I need to leave straight away? Because there was only one person at work that actually knew, none of my colleagues. It was one of the directors. And it's a bit of a bombshell to drop on people. I need to leave the office because I've been called for a kidney transplant, but yet no one knows that you need a kidney transplant, let alone that you're on dialysis. But I had that conversation in 5 minutes with my boss, and off I went. Didn't really explain anything to anybody else in the office. I said, "Cheerio, something's come up." Jumped in my car.
So no one at your workplace knew that you were a kidney patient?
No. I decided when I joined this place probably 6 months beforehand, and I decided that I was just going to keep it to me and the gatepost that I was on dialysis, just because I didn't, I didn't want to be judged. I didn't think people would understand, and I'd kept it to myself. And I think, look, they said to me after I had the transplant, "We used to think you were a special constable because you used to go somewhere on a Tuesday and a Thursday afternoon." And it couldn't be further from the truth. And so I got that call and I raced round to my mum's because she lived 2 minutes round the corner, told her I was going to hospital, and off I went to my flat to pick up a bag. I didn't have a bag ready. I wasn't one of these people who had a bag in the wardrobe ready to go. You don't need much. But what I didn't know where to park the car at Manchester Royal Infirmary. So all I remember is that I drove there, didn't know where to park, and I was in such a hurry, I just dumped it by reception. And
Really?
Yeah, I was in a hurry. I didn't really care what happened. And, it turned out that I could have had plenty of time to park the car or ask where the car park was. But my mind was thinking, get there. And even at that point, I didn't know if the transplant was happening. I didn't know how many other people might have been called. I'd never been called for a transplant. But there was just me. And the other person was an Indian gentleman who was twice my age. I was just shy of 30 and he was 60. And he'd been on dialysis for twice as long as I'd been on. He'd been on peritoneal dialysis. And yeah, later that night, after a barrage of tests and waiting, I just made the time. I think we just had to get in before 9:30 in the evening, and the transplant went ahead. This other gentleman had his before me, so I was the second one in. And it was just the two of us. We each got one kidney each from this very brave person who died of toxic plasmosis. And that, was fantastic. It was like, and other patients would probably say the same, like winning a lottery, literally. And I thought all my Christmases had come at once. I was frightened before the transplant. I was frightened about the operation. And actually, would I make it? I'd never had a general anesthetic before, but it was fine. And I breezed through, and I woke up on the Saturday morning, ecstatic from having a transplant, and probably a little bit ecstatic from all the pain relief that I was on. But I started ringing friends in my phone book and telling them and waking people up. And it was amazing. It was a bank holiday Saturday. I remember some of my friends had gone to the races down in Epsom at a derby, but I couldn't make it. And then I slowly got better over a week. Visitors came and went. My mum was happy. I was an only child, so she was made up. And it felt like I was on a new horizon and have my life back. I left the hospital. My potassium had been a little bit high, and I eventually left after 7 or 8 days. And I went back to my mum's, which was a bit of a come down because I had my own flat. My flat was for sale, actually. And then I remember going back and forth for outpatient appointments. And this was in June 2006. So by a few weeks after the transplant, by the beginning of July, I was experiencing the symptoms that I'd experienced when I had nephrotic syndrome. I was getting swollen feet and ankles, particularly after sitting down. My urine was frothy. The fear was that this is what I had before. I didn't really know about recurrence because no one had actually said that the disease could recur. And so it was a shock when I eventually had a biopsy and they said, the disease has recurred in your transplant. We'll need to treat you. You'll need to be an inpatient. And I became an inpatient on the transplant ward. I had a room to myself. And I started something called plasmapheresis, having plasma exchanges. It's a bit like dialysis, that you'll have needles in your fistula, if you've got a fistula. And over the course of about an hour and a half, your blood will be taken out of your body. It's spun round, or in some plasmapheresis, it's filtered. But in this one, it was spun, and so the blood components are separated. And my blood came back into the body. The plasma was taken off and collected in a waste bag, and fresh albumin was given back to make up the volume of my blood. And that happened over an hour and a half in a room. And I was having this about 3 times a week as an inpatient. And at the same time, I was having to be mindful about getting infections because plasmapheresis can lower your immune system. And I forget precisely, but I was in hospital pretty much all summer, give or take a few weeks, or home for the weekends, or to give the plasmapheresis time to work. And, the kidney function remained pretty good, but it was an ordeal. And you kind of felt that this wasn't the plan. I'd hoped to be free of the hospital, not have needles in my arm. And this felt like a real fly in the ointment. And then by the September, there were problems getting regular plasmapheresis at the hospital. There wasn't a dedicated plasmapheresis machine for the renal department. And in some weird twist, I ended up going to the Christie Hospital on one of their outpatient wards where patients used these plasmapheresis machines to collect stem cells. And so I learned all about stem cell collection. But I was there as a kidney patient post-transplant, having plasmapheresis to hopefully dampen down the effects of this disease. And so I was, I guess, an outlier in a cancer hospital in South Manchester. The weird thing for other patients and staff there was that here was this patient who'd learnt how to cannulate his fistula while he was on dialysis. And I didn't really like needling my arm. And so I didn't needle my arm at dialysis, and I'd learnt how to do it. But because I needed plasma exchange, I started needling my arm because it meant having treatment, because cancer nurses weren't able to needle my fistula. It would have needed a renal nurse, and they couldn't get hold of a renal nurse to come to the cancer hospital. And so I guess needs must, and I started needling my fistula. And I became pretty expert. And the cancer doctors and nurses and patients would look on in awe of this patient coming in and needling his arm. And so that carried on. And I had plasma exchange for the next 5 years, for the length of that transplant, 5.5 years. And it was like swapping dialysis for plasma exchange. You can't even do plasma exchange at home. You have to come to hospital. There was no option of, going to hospital 2-3 times a week. And it played havoc with my work. I lost the job I had. And it was a low point in my life. Life became about having plasmapheresis and trying to eke out the life of a transplant. I traveled a bit during that time. And so I took time off from plasmapheresis, but I was pretty much on maintenance plasma exchange to help that transplant. And during that period of time, I had other potions given to me in terms of rituximab, an immunosuppressant. I had heavy duty steroids, cyclophosphamide, all trying to do the same thing in terms of dampen down the effects of the FSGS. And it was hard on my body. My body was going through a lot, and I became more prone to illnesses and infections, and coughs would become chest infections, would incapacitate me. I didn't know much about pneumonias back then. But at the same time, I was exercising and as fit and as healthy as I could be. And actually, I ended up doing a half marathon with that transplant back in 2010, the year before it finally failed. And during that time, I eventually moved to London. I had all my care transferred to Guy's and St Thomas's from Manchester Royal Infirmary. And I continued for about a year having plasma exchange at Guy's. And eventually, at the beginning of 2011, we knew that transplant would eventually fail. And I was back on dialysis in the middle of 2011. And it was a real blow going back on dialysis. You lose your independence, you're back at the hospital. Treatment is far more intensive than plasma exchange, although the fistula is still being used. It's far more intensive, and you'll know from experience, and other patients will testify, it's like being in a washing machine in comparison to normal life. When you finish, you feel like you've been on a long journey. And I was having to get the bus to and from dialysis through sort of the back roads of South London, from Peckham Rye to New Cross. It was hard and it was wearisome. And at this point, I was working as well. I'm head of advocacy at the National Kidder Federation at that point. And my fiance stepped forward to donate. And so we went through the usual tests. I think Ash had offered to donate before I started dialysis in the May. And eventually we had the transplant in the October. We got married in the summer. I'd had a brief honeymoon in Paris, taking a very long weekend away from dialysis. And I started this journey again with a new transplant. But within a few weeks, not even a few weeks, within a few days, the disease had recurred. There was protein in the urine, which was an indication. And we started something called the Necker protocol, based on the hospital in Paris. They had a protocol for treating FSGS post-transplant. And I started plasma exchange again quite intensively before I finally came out of hospital. And then I was to have maintenance plasma exchange for the next 7 years, for the duration of that transplant. So my fistula was being used non-stop, from dialysis to plasma exchange during this time. And during this second transplant, the impact of steroids and immunosuppressants became apparent on my body. I became diabetic, type 2 diabetic. Started off with pre-diabetes and then type 2 diabetes with all the usual suspects in terms of medication. And that was really hard. I had hepatitis E. I always thought hepatitis was something to do with your blood. this was hepatitis E was caused by undercooked pork, maybe from a barbecue or tapas or something. And I had to reduce the immunosuppressants in order to have ribavirin, which was the treatment for this virus. And that was something else I had to go through, just another, and that probably had an impact on the FSGS and managing that in terms of reducing the immunosuppressants. But we continued with the plasma exchange. I was working full time still, and it was hard, but my body was weakening and I was getting infections, particularly after my first child was born in 2016. I had a grade A strep infection under my nose. I then had pneumonias, and I seemed to get pneumonia every Christmas for the next few years. And each time I had it, it felt like I was going to die. And, it's a very lonely thing to have pneumonia sometimes. You're worried about your transplant failing as well. Each time you go into hospital, each time there are new people looking after you that aren't necessarily renal experts, and you're having to change medications, and people didn't seem to be following you as closely as perhaps as a nephrologist would do, even though you had nephrology input. And I guess eventually, by 2018, it looked like we had a clear run and things seemed to improve slightly. And I remember we booked a holiday to go to Dubai and Mauritius, and we thought we'd get some time away. It was quite difficult to have done that with plasmapheresis, but things seemed settled. And I had some vaccinations, holiday vaccinations. But then within a week or so, there was a spike in all my protein, urea. And it was like one last relapse of the FSGS. We'd managed to be in remission a few times with the FSGS. And this was one last time that my kidney couldn't take it and I couldn't take it. And I remember there was a month in April, instead of preparing to go on this lovely holiday, I was preparing to go back on dialysis. My body was filling up with fluid. I was 10 kilos over my dry weight when I started dialysis at the end of April. Within 2 sessions, I was on the home dialysis training unit at Borough Kidney Unit, part of Guy's and St. Thomas's. And I was learning to use the NX stage kidney machine.
That's quite a rapid transition from the kidney starting to fail, knowing that you're going to start dialysis again, and then doing the training for home hemo. So what was that transition in terms of your mind and coming to terms with all of that? What was the thinking in terms of going straight to home hemo training?
Yeah, it's something that had taken a long time, Dee. I was fortunate during this time. I was working as head of advocacy, first for the NKF and then for Kidney Care UK from 2016. And I learned a lot in that job. I learned a lot about home therapy. I learned a lot about kidney disease. And I always knew that if I did go back on dialysis, for the whole length of that transplant, I was battling FSGS. And there was a steady deterioration in my kidney function over those years. We tried our best to eke out the life of that kidney, and particularly as it from a living kidney donor, it makes it all the more sorrowful when you lose that transplant. And so during that time, I'd learned a lot. I knew that I would never wanted to go back onto dialysis in centre. It just wasn't for me. The transport side of things, being surrounded by patients who aren't as well as you, had a big impact. And it kind of makes you feel institutionalized in a way. I'd made my mind up that I would be doing dialysis at home, in the comfort of my home. And I'd opted for an NX stage, and that was an option at Guy's. And the benefit of that was that you could take the machine on a holiday. When I had those sessions, I was fortunate. I was actually getting psychological treatment, that a psychologist was on hand, which was helpful. I had a really responsive consultant who championed home therapy at Guy's. And like I said, within 2 sessions, it was at the training unit. And the training unit it was like manna from heaven. It was this breath of fresh air. It was an oasis of tranquility away from, in-centre dialysis where there's lots of patients on a ward. And it was really refreshing, and it felt calm, less noisy, dedicated. People were dedicated to you and then making sure that you could go home. I think in the second session I was there, the KPA chair brought me fish and chips. It was like, That was amazing. They were bringing everyone fish and chips at the dialysis unit. I don't think they do that these days for health and safety. But it was very friendly and warm. And the ward was friendly and warm, but it was busy and hectic with other patients and other people poorlier than me. And so the training unit was dedicated. There was a dedicated space. I had time to learn. And over the next month, I was prepared and equipped by the staff there, Dave and Ange. And at the same time, we decided to move house. So we had a little bit more space to do dialysis at home. Don't have to move house to have home dialysis, but I wanted to have more space. So I had a dedicated room downstairs. And we were fortunate to do that. Not everyone can do that, and it's not a prerequisite. But for me and my thinking, it was about having it at home, but having a room that wasn't our bedroom. And so I had my first home session in the July of 2018, and I started to do sort of frequent home dialysis. I was doing about 3 hours, maybe 4 or 5 times a week from around about 7 o'clock at night. And it seemed to work. I slowly improved. My health got better. I started to exercise. I went back to work. I'd had a few months off work. But I knew that maybe a transplant and going back on the list wasn't an option. And within a few months, the diabetes disappeared because I wasn't on steroids and immunosuppressants. My blood pressure stabilized, the fluid level, excess fluid level came off. And I was feeling a lot better because of the frequent dialysis. And then clearly, I connected in the kidney world, got to listen to people, do my own research. And Maddie knows this, but Maddie was my inspiration, Maddie Warren, for going home. But I eventually started to consider doing nocturnal dialysis because clearly Maddie was doing so well. And I knew other patients as well. There was a friend at Guy's who was doing nocturnal dialysis and doing very well. And so a year later, to the day almost, in July 2019, I started to trial nocturnal dialysis at home. And it was a bit of trial and error, and I didn't sleep at all well. And it was really hard. And I'd wake up from dialysis exhausted because I hadn't slept. And I was getting used to the right prescription of dialysis and the speed and the right bag of dialysate to use. But trial and error, we finally got there, and it took about 6 months. So by the Christmas time of 2019, I'd started to sleep properly on dialysis. And it was probably a 5 out of 10 sleep. It wasn't great, but it was enough to get by. And my blood results started to really improve. I wasn't having blood pressure medication. I was still having phosphate binders, but I've always had a relaxed diet on dialysis. But my diet was really relaxed. I didn't have to worry about fluid management in the same way, perhaps 3 times a week dialysis. But I was feeling really well. I was getting more energy. And with a young child, my youngest was about 3 by then. You need all the energy you can have. And I was working full time, and it felt really good. And I remember discussing with people, with a surgeon actually, who I know, and saying, you not want to go back onto the transplant list? And that's where the decision started to solidify that I was getting a really good quality of life, really good clinical results, that my diet was good, that I could eat what I wanted, go out for meals, had the time to work full time and do the things that I wanted to do during the day. Yet I was having dialysis at night. It'll never be perfect, being a dialysis patient. I'll always find it hard to contend with being a dialysis patient, I think. It's not the life I wanted, but actually doing nocturnal dialysis was the best thing for me and the circumstances that I found myself at the end of, in terms of the chances of having the recurrent disease in a third transplant are very high. The rate of recurrence increases with each subsequent transplant. And I didn't want to become diabetic again and suffer with type 2 diabetes. My body had become fragile from having all the immunosuppressants. But on nocturnal dialysis, I was becoming stronger and able to have a fit and active lifestyle. with kids, with work, with a social life, by being the husband that I wanted to be and the father that I wanted to be and being active around the family. And it was really important for me. And the quality of life. And this is the thing. The quality of life for me on nocturnal dialysis is equal or better to the transplants that I had. And the results that I get are arguably comparable to a cadaveric kidney donor, so a deceased kidney transplant. And so while I'm having still to contend that I do have to have dialysis and I do have to put needles in my arm and I have this treatment at home, it's downstairs. I close the door on it. That works for me. And it is transformative. And I've heard other people talk about it before. And I now do 32 hours of dialysis a week. So I do 4 nights a week. And I know other dialysis patients on nocturnal will do more. But at the moment, for me, that works. And I know that in time, if I want to increase the amount of dialysis, I can do. It's meant with a young family that we can take the machine on holiday in the UK, in the back of the car, and have all the consumables delivered. And we have a near normal holiday. I've been able to go to Dubai last year and have a lovely holiday in a hot climate that I wouldn't necessarily have experienced if I, was just doing in-center dialysis. And I guess part of sharing this story is about hope. And when you're diagnosed with end-stage kidney failure and you know that you'll need a transplant or dialysis, transplant really for most people, they think of that as their plan A. The real hope is the transplant. And it's what gets you through, often through the arduous sessions of dialysis if you're doing in-center dialysis. And the hope of a transplant and better days is what you cling to, regaining your life, reclaiming your life. But for me and my circumstances, that wasn't to be. Each transplant and the hope that I had with each transplant was dashed because of the FSGS. And it was an awful thing to go through. And so I never say never. If there's a cure for FSGS or a really successful treatment, then I would consider going back on to have a transplant. But at this moment in time, quality of life that I have with being on nocturnal dialysis, and it's the nocturnal dialysis for me that really is the game changer. The quality of life that I have, it's not perfect, but actually I'm able to do so much. I'm so fit considering, I told you before what was the fun fact, and I won't be fun for everybody, but I'm training to do a half marathon. And so I did 18-kilometer run yesterday. I did an 18-kilometer run. And, not everyone will aspire to do that, but for me, it's about being as normal as I can be and keeping my body as well as it can be, keeping it as fit and healthy, getting the best blood results. And so the more dialysis I have, the better for me and my long-term life, hopefully live as long as I can on nocturnal dialysis. And so by sharing this, I'm really passionate about the patient voice and the lived experience. And I weave that into the work that I do at Kidney Care UK, the work that we do with patients and the patient advisory group and getting patients involved with the charity. But it's really important for me to share my journey. And at the beginning, it might seem horrific, but some people say, oh, you don't want a transplant. And I guess I thought that was pretty strange back when I was a 24-year-old patient listening to an expert patient and they told me that they were on dialysis and they didn't want a transplant. I thought that was really strange. I thought, wow, I'll never be that patient. But I am that patient because I found something that really works for me and gives me a quality of life that I'd never expected that I'd have. I have a quality of life that's been better than the transplants that I've had. And that's because of the unique circumstances in this disease that I've had, the FSGS. And so it won't be for everybody to make that decision. But for me, that has been the right decision to make at the moment, at the current time. And so there we are, dude. There's the story. I hope, people get something out of that, because the hope of nocturnal dialysis that brings you, for me, that's been comparable to a transplant. And there'll be people out there who are making tough decisions and thinking that maybe dialysis might be a stopgap. And I guess for those who can do home therapy, go for it. Those who decide to do nocturnal dialysis, it will change. It will be transformative. You'll find so much more energy from doing it. Not a reliance on iron or EPO. And a lot of the drugs that you may be on may be diminished, particularly around blood pressure medications, which will make you feel better. And for me, it's all about feeling as well as you possibly can. And yeah, there'll be lots of people who hopefully will get a transplant. But it's also about trying to get the best quality of life that you can while you're around. And that's what nocturnal dialysis does for me. And my treatment, my choice not to go for a transplant feels like a very good one. As the years go by and I get stronger on home hemo. So there we are. I'll stop there.
So for yourself, obviously, you've described a lot of challenges that you had to overcome during your journey that brought you to this decision. But there might be somebody listening who is at the beginning of the journey, but actually thinking, I don't think I want to go through transplantation. I don't think I want to go through the operation, but maybe their family around them, that expectation is there and they may feel pressured towards that. So for somebody who's kind of in their mind, they're conflicted about that decision, what would you say to them?
Yeah, you're right. It is a conflicting decision. I guess the proof's in the pudding. There's lots of patients. We're a small select bunch of patients that do nocturnal dialysis, but our blood results speak for themselves often. And the fact that we're able to have fulfilling lives, and life's about doing things that make you happy. Number one, I'm able to do things that make me happy. I'm able to have a job. I'm able to have a family. I'm able to contribute to my family. My days are free away from the hospital. When transplants work and they work well, then that's fantastic. The gold standard treatment. But there is an option. There is another option to give you that hope of decent quality of life away from a hospital. And so I would, for anyone listening, there is hope through nocturnal dialysis. There's hope through home therapy, first and foremost. And when you get settled on home therapy, then nocturnal dialysis is an option should you wish to take it. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is shining a light on examples where success stories. And I guess my success story of nocturnal dialysis, I want other people to know about it. I want other people to hear about it. And I know that other patients on nocturnal dialysis are the same. There's something almost evangelical about sharing your story with other patients, because you feel that other patients should have that opportunity, should they wish to have it, that it's there. And only by telling your story do patients find out about it, or by patients getting involved in charities where their stories can be shared, maybe in Kidney Matters or in patient leaflets. If we share stories and if we share good practice around the different modalities, it doesn't necessarily need to be nocturnal dialysis. But if we share stories about nocturnal dialysis, how it changes people's lives, then it gives people another option other than a transplant. And choosing a transplant can sometimes be a no-brainer for some people, but more conflicted for others, if for whatever reason they don't want the surgery or there's a risk of a disease recurring. So, yeah.
So I know that you're very active on social media. So for anyone who wants to follow you, what are your handles?
Yeah, active as I can be. So I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is @Nick_Fire1, and I'm on Blue Sky. And so my Blue Sky account, where I've moved things to, is @Nick-Fire1.bsky.social.
And as always, I will put the links to Nick's social media in the description box, so please do give Nick a follow. So today you've shared your kidney warrior story, Nick, and shared the challenges that you've overcome, your kidney transplant, the failure of those kidney transplants and your journey to making the decision not to have a kidney transplant. But as you said, that could still change in the future. Your journey from in-center haemodialysis to home haemodialysis to nocturnal haemodialysis and the benefits that has brought to your life. What is your final word of encouragement for the listeners?
My final word, it's probably words. So I think the more you know as a patient about your disease, about kidney disease, about the options, the treatment options, if you empower yourself to learn more, you can make decisions that really are tailored to your own life. And so you'll be able to do things that make you most happy. And then that feeds into your mental health. If you're able to make decisions that are tuned into your life, then your mental health will probably be looked after as well. And I guess the final word is that you need to talk about your mental health. You need to seek help. I mean, it's okay not to be okay. I think part of mental health is actually acknowledging that you're not feeling great, that you might need some help from different people. It could be family. It could be someone who's not related to you at all, counselor, social worker, could be a psychologist. And over the years, I found CBT really helpful, compassion-focused therapy, and finding someone that chimes with you when you have a therapist. You know, it might not be the first person, but it might be someone else, and choosing your therapist wisely. But I think we owe it to ourselves to seek help when we're feeling down and we're in low mood, and doing things to improve our mood. And clearly, if you're able to empower yourself with information about the patient journey, about the treatments, about the different medications maybe that you might need to have, you're able to make really good decisions that are right for you. And that feeds into your mental health as well. So yeah, education, empowerment, mental health, they're big things for me. And I think they should be big things for every patient. I guess, the patient education and empowerment, I think patients are in a lot better position these days, maybe than 20, 25 years ago when I was first on my journey. And I think we're really fortunate to have a wealth of resources that Kidney Care UK offer for patients and services to help patients reclaim their lives. And I think a lot of the time that's what Kidney Care UK will do. They will help patients reclaim their lives, whether it's through the counselling or the advocacy service, whether it's through the patient grants, or more widely through all the patient information that's available, the leaflets, the website and Kidney Matters and Kidney Kitchen. There's so much there now. And the fact that you're part of that, Dee, there's so much wealth of information for family members as well to support their loved ones. So I think for patients who might be new on their journey, familiarise yourself with the website at Kidney Care UK. And that's an entry point into helping to hopefully reclaim your life from chronic kidney disease.
Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for sharing your story, the advice and the encouragement that you've shared. I know this will help so many people. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. I truly appreciate your support. New episodes of this podcast are released every other Monday, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you found this episode helpful, why not share it with someone who might benefit too? To stay up to date with the latest episodes, news and resources, sign up for the email mailing list and join the WhatsApp channel. All the details are in the episode description. Until next time, take care and choose to live.